Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish.
There are television shows, and then there are cultural monuments. MASH was the latter. For 11 seasons, from 1972 to 1983, it didn't just entertain America. It challenged it, moved it, and sometimes broke its heart. Set against the backdrop of the Korean War, but unmistakably speaking to the anxieties of the Vietnam era, MASH was a show that dared to ask difficult questions while making you laugh through your tears. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest achievements in the history of American television. But greatness rarely comes without turbulence. Behind the laughter and the surgical wit, behind the helicopters and the heart-wrenching finales, MASH was a show in constant flux. Cast members came and went. Some left chasing bigger dreams. Some left because the emotional weight simply became too heavy to carry. Others departed because the creative direction of the show had quietly moved on without them, and a few walked away on their own terms, knowing exactly when their story had reached its natural end. Each departure left a mark on the show, on the fans, and on the actors themselves. Some of those exits became legendary moments in television history. Others were quiet, complicated, and only fully understood years later. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on all of it. This is a real reason why these actors left MASH. Tio truly understand why leaving MASH was such a significant decision. For better or worse, you first need to understand what the show actually was and what it meant to the people who made it. MASH began not as a television series, but as a novel. In 1968, Korean War veteran and Surgeon H. Richard Hornberger, writing under the pen name Richard Hooker, published a fictionalized account of his experiences performing surgery in a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War. The book was raw, funny, and deeply human. It blended dark comedy with genuine emotional honesty in a way that felt entirely new. Hollywood noticed immediately. Director Robert Altman turned the novel into a film in 1970, casting Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould in the lead roles, and producing a satirical black comedy that resonated powerfully with audiences living through the Vietnam War. The film was a sensation, winning the Palme d'Or at Cannes and an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. But the story wasn't finished yet. 2 years later, CBS brought MASH to the small screen. Developed by Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds, the television series debuted on September 17, 1972. Alan Alda stepped into the role of Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, and from that moment forward, he became the emotional and moral center of the entire series. The show kept the wartime setting and the irreverent humor of its predecessors, but deepened everything. Characters were given room to breathe, to grow, to contradict themselves, and to suffer. MASH became something television had rarely attempted before, a comedy that could genuinely devastate you. It struggled in its first season, nearly facing cancellation. But CBS made a pivotal scheduling decision, moving the show to Saturday nights, and almost overnight, everything changed. Ratings soared. Cultural impact followed. MASH became the kind of show that people didn't just watch. They talked about it, argued about it, and felt personally connected to its characters. That connection would make every cast departure feel like a personal loss. Of all the departures in MASH's long history, McLean Stevenson's was perhaps the most dramatic in terms of what produced. His exit gave the world one of the most shocking moments in television history, a scene so unexpected and emotionally devastating that it permanently changed the conversation about what a sitcom was allowed to do. McLean played Colonel Henry Blake, the commanding officer of the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. Henry was bumbling and warm, confused and compassionate, a man who was out of his depth in a war zone, but never out of heart. He provided the perfect comic and emotional counterbalance to Hawkeye's sharp cynicism. McLean's performance was widely praised, earning him a Golden Globe nomination, and the deep affection of millions of viewers. But beneath the surface of that warm television friendship, McLean was growing restless. As the show developed, Alan Alda's role expanded dramatically. Alda was not only performing as Hawkeye, but increasingly writing and directing episodes as well. His character became the gravitational center of the entire series. Everyone else, including McLean, began to orbit around him. McLean didn't hide his frustration. In a 1975 interview with People magazine, he stated plainly that he wanted to be the star, the one carrying the show. And while that desire has been interpreted by some as ego, the fuller picture is more sympathetic. McLean was a genuinely talented performer who believed he had the capacity to lead a series on his own. He looked at the enormous power of television and saw an opportunity that MASH, with an increasingly all-centric structure, was not going to give him. So at the end of Season 3, he made a decision that would define his legacy in ways he never anticipated. He told the producers he was leaving. He expected a graceful exit. What he got instead was a funeral. The writers, led by Gelbart and Reynolds, made a creative decision that was bold to the point of being audacious. Rather than writing Henry Blake off with a cheerful discharge and a wave goodbye, they chose to honor the reality of war. Henry would leave, but he would not make a home. The episode, Abyssinia, Henry, aired in March 1975. For 25 minutes, it played as a joyful farewell. There was celebration, tears, hugs, and laughter. Then, in the final moments, Radar walked into the operating room, removed his hat, and quietly delivered the news that Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan, with no survivors. The silence that followed was unlike anything American television had produced. No music swelled. No laugh track cushioned the blow. The cast's stunned reactions were, in many cases, entirely real. Only a handful of people knew what was coming. The nation was equally unprepared. CBS received thousands of letters in the days that followed. Some praised the show's honesty and courage. Others were furious. All of them were shaken. McLean, meanwhile, pursued the career he had envisioned. He signed with NBC, starred in his own sitcom, and began to build what he hoped would be a new chapter. It didn't work. His show was canceled after a single season. A follow-up fared even worse. By the early 1980s, McLean was publicly reflecting on what he had walked away from. In a 1983 interview, he admitted that he had taken himself out of the game. The tragedy of his story isn't that he failed after MASH. It's that MASH was a kind of achievement that very few people ever experience even once in a lifetime. And he recognized that too late. He passed away in 1996 at the age of 68. His colleagues remembered him with genuine warmth. And a character whose death he never actually witnessed, Henry Blake, remains one of the most beloved figures in television history. The irony is almost unbearable. In leaving MASH to find his moment, McLean inadvertently created one of television's most enduring ones. If McLean's departure was dramatic and emotionally charged, Wayne Rogers' exit from MASH was almost its polar opposite, quiet, businesslike, and legally fascinating. There was no farewell episode, no tearful goodbye. 1 week Trapper John McIntyre was there, cracking jokes and causing trouble alongside Hawkeye. The next week, he was simply gone. Wayne had joined MASH as Trapper John from the very beginning, and the chemistry between his character and Alda's Hawkeye was electric. They were the show's beating heart in its early seasons. Two rebellious surgeons using humor and mischief as weapons against the absurdity of war. The dynamic worked because it felt genuinely equal. Two men, two friends, one shared purpose. But as the series evolved, that equality eroded. Alda's increasing creative involvement in the writing and direction of the show meant that Hawkeye grew in complexity, depth, and narrative importance, while Trapper remained largely static. Wayne later described the shift with characteristic directness. Trapper had gone from co-lead to the character who simply nodded at whatever Hawkeye said. Wayne's frustration was not born of vanity. It was rooted in a commitment to storytelling integrity. He believed characters needed to grow, to change, to be challenged. Trapper wasn't being given those opportunities. And so, quietly, without announcing his decision to the press or making any dramatic statements, he chose not to renew his contract at the end of Season 3. Here is where the situation takes a genuinely unusual turn. Wayne had never actually signed a formal contract with the show. His entire participation in MASH had been based on a handshake agreement. When the producers realized he was gone and threatened legal action, they quickly discovered they had no legal ground to stand on. There was no signed contract to breach. Wayne had simply walked away from an informal arrangement, entirely within his rights. The show was caught off guard. Writers scrambled to explain Trapper's absence at the start of Season 4, settling on the explanation that he received his discharge while Hawkeye was on R&R leave. Audiences were understandably jarred. First Henry Blake, now Trapper John. MASH seemed to be dismantling itself. But something unexpected happened. In replacing Trapper with B.J. Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell, the show found a different and arguably more mature emotional register. B.J. was more introspective, more conflicted, and more openly vulnerable than Trapper had ever been. The buddy comedy of the early seasons gave way to something deeper and more complex. Wayne moved on to a life that had little to do with Hollywood. He had studied history at Princeton and had always possessed a sharp, analytical mind. In the decades following MASH, he became a successful financial investor and a regular television commentator on economic affairs, appearing frequently on Fox News. He made his real fortune, not in front of the camera, but in the market. Alan Alda once said that Wayne was among the smartest people he had ever worked with, and the affection between the two men lasted until Wayne's death in 2015 at the age of 82. His legacy on MASH is quieter than Henry Blake's, but no less significant. Trapper John was where it all began, and Wayne Rogers brought that character to life with an ease and naturalism that made everything around him look effortless. Some roles take more from an actor than others. For Gary Burghoff, playing Corporal Walter Radar, O'Reilly was not just a performance. It was an extended emotional excavation that eventually left him depleted in ways that went far beyond professional fatigue. Radar was, in many respects, the soul of MASH, wide-eyed and innocent, with an almost supernatural ability to sense incoming helicopters before anyone else could hear them. He was the show's conscience. While Hawkeye fought the war with wit and BJ fought it with sentiment, Radar simply absorbed it. He was too kind to the world he had been dropped into, and that vulnerability was precisely what made him so affecting to watch. Gary was the only member of the television cast to have played his character in the original 1970 film, which gave him a unique and sometimes burdensome sense of ownership over Radar. He brought a fragility to the role that had not existed in the film version, transforming Radar from a comic sidekick into a genuinely moving portrait of lost innocence. But that depth came at a cost. Gary was a perfectionist who struggled with anxiety and, by his own admission, with depression. The production schedule of MASH was relentless, and the emotional demand of playing such a tender, exposed character season after season began to wear him down significantly. He also found himself wrestling with feelings of being undervalued, a sense that despite Radar's centrality to the show's emotional fabric, he was not receiving the recognition or compensation that reflected his contribution. Beyond the professional frustrations lay something more personally urgent: his family. By the late 1970s, Gary was married with a young daughter, and the long hours on set meant that he was missing the years of her childhood that he could never recover. He later described the time lost with his daughter as a regret that stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. By season 8, Gary had made his decision. He wanted out, not because the show had wronged him, but because he needed to take care of himself and the people he loved. The producers, understanding the significance of the moment, gave Radar a proper farewell. The 2-part episode Goodbye, Radar is among the most emotionally resonant hours in the entire series. It showed the 4077 struggling in Radar's absence, and Radar himself finally coming to terms with the fact that it was time to go home. The final image, Radar walking away across the Korean landscape, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, was wordless and perfect. After MASH, Gary stepped back from acting almost entirely. He devoted himself to painting, to wildlife conservation, and to a passion for inventing that produced several genuine patents. He found in the quieter rhythms of that life something that Hollywood had never given him: peace. Major Frank Burns was one of television's great comic villains. Petty, pompous, cowardly, and magnificently insufferable. Larry Linville played him with a committed precision that made Frank both unbearable and utterly watchable. For 5 seasons, Frank was a punching bag and the antagonist, the man audiences loved to despise. But Larry Linville was a considerably more versatile actor than Frank Burns ever required him to be, and by the end of season 5, he had arrived at a quiet but firm conclusion. The character had nothing left to give. Frank's insecurities had been established, exploited, and recycled. His hypocrisies had been exposed. His relationship with Margaret Houlihan had run its comic course. There was nowhere left to take him that the show hadn't already been. Rather than wait to be pushed, Larry made the decision himself. He walked away voluntarily. telling producers that he had taken Frank as far as the character could go. There was no bitterness in his departure, no public grievance. It was a decision of an actor with genuine self-awareness about both his abilities and his limitations within a particular creative context. His departure had profound consequences for the show. Without a cartoonish villain to anchor its conflicts, MASH was forced to evolve. The moral tensions that had previously been externalized through Frank's antagonism now had to come from within the characters themselves, from the ambiguities of the war, from the contradictions of people under sustained and impossible pressure. The show became richer for it. Larry continued working in television and film after MASH, but never found a role that matched the visibility or cultural impact of Frank Burns. He passed away in 2000. His contribution to MASH, 5 seasons of brilliantly calibrated comic villainy, remains one of the show's foundational pleasures. Not every story in MASH is about departure. Some are about endurance, and no story of endurance in the series is more remarkable than that of Loretta Swit, who played Major Margaret Hot Lips Hooligan across all 11 seasons. When MASH began, Margaret was essentially a joke. Her nickname told you everything the early writers thought she was, an object of ridicule, a foil for Hawkeye and Trapper's rebellious humor, a woman defined by her relationships with men and her rigid adherence to military protocol. She was not written as a complex person. She was written as a type. Loretta refused to accept those terms. Season by season, she worked to bring dimension to Margaret, to find intelligence, the vulnerability, the genuine professionalism beneath the caricature. She pushed back in writers' rooms, in conversations with producers, and through performances themselves. Gradually, Margaret transformed. She became a decorated officer, a skilled and respected head nurse, a woman capable of questioning the war's cruelty even while performing her duties with absolute dedication. By the final seasons, Margaret Hooligan was one of the most fully realized characters on the entire show, male or female. She had grown more visibly and more meaningfully than almost anyone else in the ensemble. And Loretta was one of only 4 cast members to appear in both the pilot episode and the series finale. In a show populated by men who came and went, Loretta Swit stayed, fought for her character's dignity, and won. That is its own kind of extraordinary story. Looking back across the full arc of MASH's 11 seasons and all the exits that shaped it, what emerges is not simply a story of Hollywood egos or contract disputes. It is something more complex and more human than that. McLean Stevenson left chasing a dream that turned out to be smaller than the one he abandoned. Wayne Rogers left because the show had quietly stopped telling his character's story. Gary Burghoff left because the show had taken more from him emotionally than he could continue to give. Larry Linville left because he understood, with admirable clarity, that both he and his character had reached the end of what was possible. And Loretta Swit never left at all, because she understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what she had. Each of these decisions, the impulsive ones, the calculated ones, the heartbroken ones, shaped MASH in ways that were often unforeseen. The show bent and adjusted and found new depths in response to every loss. In that sense, MASH was not diminished by its departures. It was defined by them. What those actors shared, regardless of the circumstances of their exits, was the experience of having been part of something genuinely rare, a show that mattered, that changed how people thought about war and comedy and human connection. Some of them knew it at the time. Some only understood it later, looking back across the distance of years. But MASH knew, and so did the millions of people who watched every single week, waiting to see who would still be standing in the 4077th, and grieving quietly every time someone left.